I gave him everything. My time, the plans I folded into my chest like origami, the quiet pauses I saved for him at the end of long days. 15 days before the wedding, he said 3 words over the phone that sounded like a verdict. We need to talk. He came home, not alone. He opened the door, and the light from the hallway painted a slice across the living room. I remember the way his face looked, confused, almost guilty, as if he were the one who'd found himself. Behind him was her, the woman who had stood beside me when I tried on dresses, who had given me makeup tips and met my mother at the engagement lunch. She was holding his hand like it was nothing special, like it was perfectly ordinary. The sound of the lock clicking felt loud enough to split the room. "I can't live a lie," he said, as if that explained everything. Her eyes were wet and blank at once. I watched the dress hanging in the closet, the silk still heavy with the scent of the dry cleaner, and it felt absurd, as if a costume for someone else's life. My keys went clattering on the table, and then I didn't move for a long time. They told me they were in love. They told me they'd been honest with themselves. They looked at me, waiting for the expression that would make their decision sensible. Anger, negotiation, anything. I had nothing to give them, not that night. 4 years of plans, of Friday night routines and shared apartment compromises collapsed into a single, bright break. The wedding planner called. The venue sent an automated message that said, "We're sorry." Guests messaged with a mix of confusion and a cruelty that stung more than I expected. Comments scrolled under a photo we had taken last winter. She deserved better. What did she do? People took sides the way the weather takes direction, fast and forceful. If you've ever been betrayed and had to start over, stay with me. This gets harder before it gets better. The first weeks were a fog made of small, exact things. I sat on the floor with the wedding invitations stacked beside me and ripped one in half. I took down the veil and folded it into a box. Refunds meant talking to numbers that didn't know me and wouldn't understand the weight of the phone call I'd received. My freelance clients wavered. My answer to casual questions, "Are you okay?" became a rehearsed script. Social media was its own wound. Friends I thought I knew sided in strange ways. Some stayed silent. Someone put a photo of me and Jorge up with the caption, "What a shame," and the comments made the humiliation public. I moved back to my mother's apartment for a while. The smell of her coffee in the morning was a thread that held me upright. My mother didn't offer platitudes. She cooked quietly, and when I cried, she let me, without trying to fix me. That safety gave me space to unravel, to admit that I had stopped looking for myself somewhere in the middle of planning a life for 2. I had paused things, jobs, little ambitions, because we were building a shared outline. When that outline burned, I had to learn to read my own handwriting again. Weeks passed with small, ordinary rhythms. I walked the same block until the muscles in my legs remembered I belonged to my body. I cleaned my old studio desk, found a box of notes from past projects, and started to sketch again. The work that had been mine before him felt like a door that could be reopened. I posted a few pieces of my portfolio online, the kind of posts I used to share when I wanted to be seen. I did not expect the knock. It came late on a rainy Tuesday. I was at the table with a cup of tea gone cold. There was a steady, assured rhythm on my door. When I opened it, the man in front of me was not the type I would have pictured in my fractured memories. He was tall, calm, and wore a suit that looked like it had been designed for someone who disliked fuss. His hair had a stubborn streak of gray at the temples, like someone who'd laughed too much for his age. He introduced himself as Mauricio Silva, CEO of a regional hospitality group, and said he'd seen my work. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like an observation. "I don't need flattery," he told me. "I need someone who can make people believe in starting again." In his hand, he held a small envelope, an invitation to run a test week for a new office they wanted to open. 1 week, he said. No promises, impress me, or walk away. It felt impossible and necessary all at once. I wanted to say no, because I was raw, because I had nothing to offer, because the idea of trust still prickled. But I also wanted to prove something, to myself more than to anyone else. I agreed. 1 week. The first days were a blur of research and whispered deadlines. I turned the heartbreak into a lens. If trust could be rebuilt in small actions, could a campaign be built around that same fragile architecture? The idea that seized me was simple. People carry their past into new beginnings. What they needed wasn't denial of loss, but a design that honored it, soft lighting that made rooms feel safe again, language that assumed courage over innocence, ads that didn't promise perfection, but permission. I worked through nights that smelled of printer ink and stale coffee. I drew mood boards on my living room floor, taped silver thread samples next to coffee stains, and practiced pitches until the words stopped tasting like rehearsal. Mauricio didn't hover. He gave me space and clear expectations. That, more than flattery, was a kind of respect I had never received from Jorge. When I presented the campaign on the final day of the test, the room was quiet. Silence can be merciless, but it can also be a holding breath before something larger. Then people began to clap. It wasn't the desperate applause of desperation. It was the simple, steady clap of people who had been convinced. They hired me. The office became a new kind of home, a bright, modern space that smelled faintly of citrus and ambition. My days filled with meetings, budget spreadsheets, and the kind of problem-solving that makes the hours vanish. The work demanded things I hadn't known I still had: strategy, stubbornness, a taste for details. I built a team and watched them take my rough idea and make it sharper, kinder. Success didn't erase the wound, but it softened the edges. Mauricio and I started to spend time beyond work items. At first, it was practical: feedback on presentations, late dinners after demanding days. Those dinners turned into long conversations. He listened in a way that felt like a relief. He remembered details about my past projects. He asked questions about my mother. He took my silence seriously and never filled it with his own voice. The differences between what he offered and what I had given up were clear. He never dismissed my opinions, and he never assumed the center of our conversations. He made small gestures that began to matter: an umbrella left at the office for me on rainy days, a note about a book he thought I'd like, a way of saying, "Are you sure?" when I wanted to forget to advocate for myself. There was tenderness there, but tenderness does not erase mistrust. I still woke with the phantom feeling that someone could open my door and disappear with the bottom half of my world. Love, I learned, doesn't silence that possibility. It makes you decide whether a person is worth the risk. Then one night, a text from Jorge arrived. It was brief and precise with intent. "You don't know who he really is," it said. The words were meant to fracture the new architecture I had built. They functioned as an itch that would not be ignored. I showed the message to Mauricio because secrecy grows like mold if left unchecked. He read it slowly, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "He's stirring," he said. "Old habits." There was a hesitation afterward, a small breath that turned into a confession. He had not been entirely truthful about how he first found me. The story he'd given me, of a chance encounter at a charity event, of clicking on a random portfolio link, wasn't exactly how it had happened. He had known of me because someone had praised my work and suggested I might be the right person. He had allowed me to believe in randomness for the sake of a smoother start. "That's not nothing," I said. "You let me believe in a lie." "It was omission," he corrected, "not invention. I wanted you to come without feeling watched. I wanted you to choose this because you wanted to." His fingers curled around his coffee mug like he was holding on to proof of his own sincerity. There are lies that are intended to protect and lies that are intended to deceive. His was somewhere in the messy middle. I didn't decide right away. I sat with the fact that the man I was growing fond of had not been entirely transparent. It mattered. Integrity matters when you ask someone to rebuild trust with you. A few days later, Claudia sent me a message asking to meet. When she sat across from me at the cafe, I had not planned on letting my expression soften. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders rounded in toward herself, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. The cafe smelled of baked bread and citrus, and the noise of the barista's steaming milk felt oddly domestic in the face of confession. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Those two words carried everything: the sequence of choices, the pride she had traded for a moment, the way she'd let desire or confusion override friendship. She told me she had been the one to mention me to Mauricio. She had admired her work for a long time, and when she found herself entangled with Jorge, she panicked. She thought, naively, she confessed, that if she could get help putting him into a place of stability, he would choose her, that she could rebuild something durable. She was clear-eyed about her wrongs. "I wanted him to be better," she said, "and I thought if I could steer it, I could keep him. I don't have a defense. I'm sorry." Her explanation didn't undo the betrayal. It did, however, present a human who was not a cartoon villain, but someone who had made a mistake and been wrecked by it. She told me she had moved out of town shortly after, changed her job, and spent nights in therapy that made her both quieter and more honest. I believed some of it. Belief and permission are different things. I forgave some of her, enough to breathe in the same room without my jaw tightening, but I also set limits. I didn't let her back into the fold of my life the way she had before. Trust, once cracked, needs repair that is slow and visible. Jorge tried to insert himself into the new narrative with all the arrogance of someone who expected the story to be about him. He called, then texted, then left a voicemail that sounded like a plea masked as accusation. "You don't have to throw everything away," he said. "You're making a mistake." I listened and then hung up. I emailed him once, simply, "Do not contact me again." Then I blocked his number. It was not an act of triumph, it was an act of preservation. With Mauricio, I asked for honesty in action, not just in words. He agreed to be transparent about meetings, to include me in conversations that felt like they used to happen outside of my view. He kept texts professional, then gradually more personal, but always steady. We made rules: no surprise visits, clarity in introductions, time to check in if something felt off. I asked for time, and he gave it. He did not kneel and ask for my hand. Instead, he knelt one evening in the quiet of my small living room, not with a ring, but with a promise. "I don't expect you to forget," he said, voice small. "I only want a chance to show up differently. Let me earn it, every day. Let me be accountable to you." The gesture was both humility and petition. He wasn't asking me to absolve him of the omission. He was asking to be allowed to prove his intentions through steady action. I could have said no. I could have held my single wound like an heirloom. Instead, I said yes to the slow thing, yes to watching, yes to testing, yes to letting someone earn space in my life again. Love didn't feel like surrender. It felt like an agreement built from the ground up with conditions that protected me. Months unfolded like a well-paced series, dinners that ended with arguments about trivial matters and then laughter, days when we held silence because words weren't necessary, moments when I saw him advocate for me at meetings, making sure my ideas had the light they deserved. He introduced me to his world slowly, An intimate dinner with a couple of board members, a weekend where we visited a property that needed revitalizing. He never asked me to compete with the memory of what I'd lost. Instead, he carved out a new memory. Quiet walks under streetlights, a Sunday morning where he took my mother flowers, the way he learned my favorite coffee. Still, I insisted on markers of accountability. I asked that he tell me about past relationships frankly, and he did, with a measured honesty that did not excuse mistakes but contextualize them. I wanted to know, in small ways, that his actions were not just kind because they were convenient. He started to leave little notes on my desk. One said, simply, "Thank you for trusting me today." They were small confirmations that he was aware of the work trust requires. There were tests, naturally. One evening at a restaurant, he laughed at something a colleague said, and for a moment, the old panic rose like smoke. I noticed the way my hands tightened around the napkin. He reached across the table and squeezed my fingers. "I see you," he said, and the sound of it anchored me. He didn't plow through my reaction with explanations. He made space for it. The rebuilding was not secretive. I told my mother about the rules he'd agreed to. I told my friends. I told myself. Transparency mattered less because it was performative and more because it made the work real. It meant that when doubts came, I could find evidence of transformation, consistent behavior, not merely words. 6 months after the first test week, the week that had felt like an audition for life, I stood before 10 people in a small, sunlit garden and said yes to a wedding that looked nothing like the one I had once planned. It was intimate by design. My mother, a handful of old friends, Mauricio's sister, and a few colleagues who had watched me rebuild. I wore a simple dress that felt like me. No veil, no choreographed promises. I spoke about the days when my world had been narrowed to the width of a phone screen, and how courage had been the practice of choosing differently every morning. Mauricio didn't kneel on his wedding day. We looked at each other and made promises that felt like plans. I promised to call out when I felt insecure rather than shut down. He promised to never let omission hide itself as kindness. We agreed on small rituals, weekly check-ins, a rule of honesty around important conversations, the freedom to ask for space without dramatics. It was not a cinematic surrender. It was a mutual contract. People sometimes ask me if I regret the years I invested in someone who proved unfaithful. The honest answer is complicated. I regret the naive moments, perhaps, but not the parts of me that loved with intention. Those parts, my capacity to be vulnerable, to plan, to believe, did not disappear when they were betrayed. I found ways to place them back into my own life. Giving someone everything once does not mean I can never choose to give myself everything again. There are memories I still guard, snapshots that ache, a dress hanging, a voicemail, the sting of an unwelcome comment. They linger not to punish, but to remind me of the rules I now carry. Clarity before commitment, transparency as a condition, the courage to walk away when something is irreparably wrong. I forgave Claudia in part because guilt had consumed her and remade her in a way that meant she could not simply walk back into my life and take what she had given up. I cut off Jorge because the person he had been left no room for the person I was trying to become. Mauricio's initial omission remained a wound we had to dress daily. He never expected a blanket pardon. He learned to earn trust in the smallest ways. Consistent texts that didn't ask for forgiveness, showing up at meetings and acknowledging my ideas publicly, small acts of care that were repeated until they formed a pattern. He never demanded that I forget. He asked instead to be observed honestly. Action became his apology and his argument for being trusted. I rebuilt my career into somewhere I had always wanted it to go. I started giving talks about starting over, about how professional reinvention can be both an act of healing and an act of ambition. People came to those talks because they had been betrayed, because they had been laid off, because their lives had been reoriented by forces outside of their control. I taught them that beginning again is not a failure, it is a choice. If there is a lesson to the story, it is not that betrayal can be romanticized into redemption. It is that you can survive the breaking and choose a new kind of brave. Sometimes the person who shows you who they are in the worst of nights is someone you will never see again. Sometimes the person who earnestly falters and then works to mend themselves can be given a guarded second chance. Those are not equivalent. One requires exile, the other requires vigilance. So when people ask me about the man I never wanted to meet, the one who walked into my doorway 15 days before a wedding, I tell them that night did its violence, but it also revealed what I could not ignore. It made me ask hard questions about who I would be if my life had to be rebuilt from rubble. It taught me to match affection with standards. It taught me the value of being a participant in my own story, not merely a character someone else wrote for me. I married someone who had been imperfect, but willing to do the work to be different. I married someone who had failed to be fully honest at first, and then committed to living transparently. I did not marry the idea of perfection. I married the willingness to be accountable. The ending is not tidy. There are days, even now, when mistrust tries to creep in. I meet it with words, with boundaries, with the slow arithmetic of repeated kindness. Would you give someone a second chance after they lied to you? Tell me in the comments. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. There are more conversations here about what it means to rebuild, to forgive within limits, and to choose yourself in the aftermath.